Hello and welcome along to this session from Bilsley Research School on metacognition and self-regulated learners. My name is Mark Harris. I'm Director of Teacher Development for the Mercy and Trust, and I'll also be joined by my colleague Dominic Davis, who's Professional Development Lead for the Blackpool Trust. We're both ELEs associated with Bilsley Research School, and it's an absolute delight and pleasure to be able to welcome you along to today's session. So to outline the aims of the session today, we'll be looking at the updated report on metacognition and self-regulated learning. We'll be considering how pupils can be explicitly taught to plan, monitor and evaluate their learning, and also how teachers can help to model, scaffold and gradually release that responsibility so that their learners can become more independent. The session will also focus on translating the evidence into classroom practice as well, and how we can support learners who may struggle with confidence, motivation, accessing tasks and also strategies to use as well when they do get stuck. So looking at the recommendation one, that first one is around gaining that awareness about what schools should be doing to support staff and teachers to understand what we really mean by metacognition. And part of this is really thinking a little bit deeper than just, it's not just thinking about thinking, it's more than that, and it really has moved on. So really breaking that down into the key components which students need, so their beliefs about themselves, what strategies they need to do and use, and also what they can do if they are struggling to access a task as well, and also getting overcoming that cognitive overload that students may encounter as well. So this first diagram really just brings to life some of those key aspects of metacognition in the loop for lifelong learning. And the first part is around that awareness and the foundations of their self-awareness. So their existing awareness around tasks and their own self-beliefs towards tasks as well. What the task might actually require from the students. How the students are then able to plan, monitor and also reflect on their learning as well within the classroom, not only post activity but also during the activity as well. And then it's that continual refinement for the students about how they can then employ those same skills, that knowledge of self, that knowledge of skills and knowledge of task to future tasks and activities in the future as well. The first bit then is us thinking about why learners fail. So I've come to this through the lens of looking and trying to identify how students struggle and what students might be struggling with in the classroom, and how metacognition can help to support those learners. I think there's some presumption around what metacognition can be for students who are really great learners, but if we refocus that and think of it through the lens of students who struggle, then I think this could be a really productive session for us to think through that lens. So why learners fail is one of the key things for us to understand. The key aim here is to understand the three breakdown model around self, strategies and task. I want to emphasise the phrase on the slide around learners' failures being predictable as well, in the sense of if we do get that breakdown in one of those three areas, then it's what we can do to actually tackle that and rebuild those key things around motivation, poor attitude, a lack of resilience, or that learned helplessness, which we might see in some of our students as well. So the three breakdown model then looks at these three components around knowledge of self, knowledge of strategies and knowledge of task. And it's rarely random when we see failure within the classroom, because it's a breakdown of one of those three components. It's about how the learners see themselves. So do they believe that they can succeed? Do they see themselves as someone who can improve, or have they built a history of failure that now shapes their identity of a learner? So this is going beyond, it's not growth mindset, this is something different about their internal scripts which they may tell themselves. So when they come up against tasks, so for example, they might say, oh, I can't do maths. Well, it's not the fact you can't do maths. You might struggle with one component of maths, but it doesn't mean that you're not able to do maths. And it's about that self-dialogue and how we can tackle that as well. So if they say things like, I'm bad at this, I never get this right, there's no point in trying, is that first component of knowledge of self. The second is knowledge of strategies. This is about whether the learners know what to do and when to do it and how to do it. And do they know how to plan for tasks? Do they know how to monitor whether their approach is working? And do they know how to evaluate afterwards as well within their work? And many learners struggle with this part, so they might not have access to some of those metacognitive skills yet, and that's how we can support them. And the third is the knowledge of task. So this is about whether the learners can actually access the task being given to them. So have they got that prior knowledge? Have they already got that cognitive skills? Do they know what success looks like? Is the task too cognitively demanding at this point, and what we can do to support that? The important message here is that it's not a deficit model. We're not using self strategies and tasks to label pupils, but we're using them to identify where we need to intervene and where that support is necessary. And it's trying to step away from the over-reliance that students may have on us as well. So if we look at the breakdown, what this might look like in class. So a self-breakdown might look like a refusal to start, the head's on the desk, there could be tears, it could be shut down, it could be that over-reliance on adults, putting the hand up straight away before they've even engaged in a task, or just simply just sitting there and being really passive learners as well within the classroom. So it's not necessarily naughty, but it's not naughty behaviour, it's just the fact that they're just not necessarily engaging with it, or the fact that they want to misbehave to get out of that challenge as well. So I'll throw a pen to get told off or to get sent out of the class to stop me having to engage with this as well. So the strategies breakdown looks different. So the learners might stare at the task blankly. They might not want to start. They might want to keep using an ineffective approach. They might just get on with it straight away, but haven't really thought about the processes which they need. They may copy a peer because they don't know what else to do, or they may just refuse to engage with that task as well. And then the task breakdown is different. So the learners may have misunderstood the question. They may lack that prior knowledge that the task already assumes. They may be overwhelmed with maybe multi-step processes, and they may not know what information is really important or what strategies to use at this point. So it's important about how we can start to support students with that. And then all of this will help to try and build that confidence together as well, because all of these things are interacted and interlinked as well. So if they fail in one, if they're struggling in one area, it might lead to failure in other areas as well. Okay, so motivation isn't separate here. So it's quite explicit in the report. The EEF Foundation identifies those three essential components of self-regulation, cognition, metacognition, and motivation are all interrelated. So cognition is that mental processes involved in understanding and learning. This is often subject specific. So for example, in maths, it might involve selecting the right problem solving method. In history, it might involve looking at arguments within a piece of text as well, and using sources of evidence to support an argument. In science, it might be understanding the process or applying a concept. So metacognition then is about how learners monitor and direct their learning. So this is where planning, monitoring and evaluating come in. And then motivation is the willingness to engage, those cognitive and metacognitive skills which we've just spoken about. It includes effort, persistence and the belief in the value of the task as well. So it's tempting to treat motivation as a separate, that they could do this if they were motivated, but actually it's the relationship between all of these. So it is really quite complex, and that low self-efficacy kills that strategy as well. So that missing foundational knowledge creates that cognitive overload, and that cognition kills that motivation as well. So the solution is not a simple one, and it's not simply just to motivate the students. The solution is to design learning so that pupils can experience success, access the strategies, and understand the task as well. So really there are these three pillars of that self-regulated learning which we've just spoke about. The idea about the cognition, that mental processes of learning, the metacognition and how we can direct learning as well, and how they can self-direct around planning, monitoring and evaluating, and then it's that motivation as well. So all of those things sitting together, and it's the interaction of those as well, which is really important to identify. So here are just a few questions just to test our retrieval on some of those points as well. So metacognition is a generic skill that transfers automatically across subjects. Is that true or false? Well, it's false, because metacognition strategies are best taught within that subject content as well. So what I'm learning in geography, what I'm learning in maths is going to be different between those subjects, and how we can support our learners with those metacognitive skills. Question 2 is motivation is separate. It's a separate component from metacognition and self-regulated learning. That's false, because cognition, metacognition and motivation all interact in complex ways, as we've just spoken about. And a learner who avoids tasks may be protecting themselves from further failure. Is that true or false? That's true, because with that avoidance behaviour often masks that low self-efficacy and low motivation as well. Okay, so the takeaways from that first recommendation then is really around that learners' failure is predictable, not random, and it sits in that self, strategy or task area, or that breakdown of those three components. Motivation is integral to this, it's not separate, so it runs through all three of those areas as well. The behaviour that looks like defiance often masks that low self-efficacy or task inaccessibility. The three breakdown model gives us that diagnostic tool as well, so it's not a label. So if we know some of those problems which learners may experience, so a breakdown of those three parts, how now can we start to rebuild that learning, and what can we put in place to support learners as they move through tasks as well? So here we've got this idea around move from diagnostic to action now. So where we see this within our classroom, we're looking for practical ways to rebuild that knowledge of self, teach that metacognitive strategies, and also repair their confidence. So thinking about, so asking yourself, what would this look like for them? What would I need to change in my language, in my task design, or even in my modelling as well? So recommendation 2 looks at that explicit instruction does not denote simply telling, but describing the activities as well. It orchestrates the effect learning of their pupils as well. So if strategies are broken down, we need to teach those strategies explicitly. If task access is broken down, then again we need to diagnose that missing knowledge as well. So let's start with self-efficacy as a learner, as the learner's beliefs. So that phrase is really important, that idea about how we start to rebuild that knowledge of self. And we can do this through mastery experiences, so actually allowing them to experience success. So it's not just praise, but we're really being direct about what we are praising as well, and being explicit with that. So it's not just that's good work, what exactly was good about their work. So was it the fact that they've used explicit vocabulary, tier 3 vocab or tier 2 vocabulary? Is it the fact that they were able to use prior knowledge and build that into their answer? Whatever it might be, we're being really explicit about what success looks like within that lesson, and what that praise really was around. And then helping learners to attribute success to effort and strategy as well. So it's not just the fact that you're clever, it's the fact that you were able to apply these skills really successfully. And all of this sits within that safe and belonging classroom as well, that if a learner's in survival mode, then they cannot really access those skills which they need to be successful within the lesson. So the confidence repair protocol to rebuild self, that first one is around naming past success as well, which the pupil may well have had. So for example, last Tuesday you were great at doing this work, or last lesson you were fantastic at applying prior knowledge, or you used some really great vocabulary last lesson, let's do that again this lesson, to really give them that confidence in their past success. Connect that to the learner quality. So this tells them that you've got a strategy, give it a go, I'm here if you need some help, but let's see what you can get started with as well. And then bridging to today's task. Today's task is really similar. I'll share the strategy first, then you give it a go. And then it's that reflection part as well, where you can get the students to really reflect on their learning. To rebuild strategy access then, this is around some of those skills which we've spoken about as well. So it's not just telling the students to reflect, it requires some prompt as well. So it's not just thinking about your learning or checking your work. So for metacognition to be useful, pupils need that explicit instruction. So explaining what is useful model is how to use it. Give pupils that guided practice, and then that gradual release responsibility is key here. So the key cycle is to plan, monitor and evaluate. So planning involves asking those questions. So what do I already know? What strategies can I use for this task? And what will success look like? And that's such an important part about what success will look like, and sharing that success criteria with students can be so powerful. And then monitoring involves asking the questions, is this working? What do I need to change? Am I stuck? What's worked? what would I do differently in that evaluative stage as well, and how could I use this again in the future. So the critical point is to use these questions which need to be taught through that subject content, which is so key. So for example, in history, planning might identify the command words. It might be to do with recalling relevant knowledge and deciding what evidence to use when supporting an argument. In maths, it might be about monitoring what you're being specifically asked, what method is going to fit that problem. In art, it might be about evaluating, comparing various different techniques and what techniques to use in a certain painting or drawing as well. So it's not how to teach metacognition as a separate thing, it's about how does that planning, monitoring and evaluating naturally sit within your subject area or within the subject which you're teaching at the time. So if we think about now rebuilding task access, this is where we need to be really clear with our student about what might be the missing foundational knowledge. So here it's not necessarily about metacognitive prompts from before, it's about what we can do to access that prior knowledge as well. So going back or giving them really explicit support about what prior knowledge they may well be missing. Sorry. And then to do this, we could use the EEF 7-step model, which would be really useful for this part. So step 1 is to activate that prior knowledge. So what do students already know and what will help them to access this? Step 2 is that explicit strategy instruction. Name the strategy and explain it. Step 3 is around modelling. This is crucial. We need to think aloud so that pupils can hear that invisible decision making which we make. So as experts, we've got all that knowledge in our heads about how to do these things. So thinking aloud and showing those steps is so powerful for students. So if, for example, you might say, right, if I have this question in front of me, the first thing I need to do is to identify the command word, which is to do with describe. So here I just need to say what I see. It's not about giving explanations, giving reasons for it. And then as you start to move through those questions, it's being supportive and explicit with your thinking as well. And then as we start to move through, we need that part about checking for understanding. So can pupils explain the strategy back? Can they identify where and how they would use it? Step 5 is that guided practice. So pupils try it with the teacher's support. And then step 6 is then that independent practice, taking away that scaffold or reducing scaffold to allow the students that ability, that opportunity to apply their knowledge, skills and understanding to the task as well. And this model can be applied flexibly for learners with SEND as well. You might need to spend a little bit more time on modelling. Some pupils might need a little bit more explicit instruction and clear instruction about what they need to do. Getting students to repeat back what they need to do is also a useful prompt as well for students to work with. And then to reduce that cognitive load on tasks, so working memory is limited. So when working memory is overloaded, learning stops. It's particularly important when we're teaching those metacognitive strategies because the strategy itself adds that cognitive demand. So if we introduce a new strategy while also introducing new difficult subject content, pupils may not have enough working memory available for either of those things. So we can reduce that overload in several ways. The first is to break that task down into several steps, teaching one step at a time and then presenting all instructions rather than presenting all instructions at once. Secondly is to use those worked examples, showing pupils what success looks like before asking them to produce their own is also really key. And then third, providing those external aids, so displays, prompt cards, vocabulary maps, graphic organisers can also help to support students access that working memory. Then that fourth one is about activating that prior knowledge. So when pupils can draw on that knowledge stored in that long-term memory, it will allow working memory to be freed up. So this is a critical point. So when introducing new metacognitive strategies, try to reduce that difficulty of the subject content at first. So this doesn't mean dumbing down, it just means creating those conditions for pupils to learn that strategy successfully before applying it in more complex context as well. So this routine is one which you might want to use within your class. It might be considered a little bit twee, but I think it's got some really good points to it about how we can start to build students thinking independently with some of their work as well. So it gives pupils that great graduated support ladder to access tasks as well. So that first one is brain, so think first, reread the question, what do I already know? The second is about using the board or checking the board. Is there a worked example, key vocabulary or success criteria I can use? Third is around checking your notes in your book or resources, which you might have already done before, looking back, looking at prior examples which you may have. The fourth is about asking a partner, but explaining what you may well have already tried. And then that fifth one is about boss, but asking the teacher to explain again or to get their support when students are accessing that task. So there's a routine there, a bit of a model which your students might want to use. And then two questions to really reflect on for this section, which is around which one of the strategies do you think you could teach explicitly next week? And what would I need to model for my learners to use it as well? So that idea about how can we make these strategies more explicit for them. I hope you found it useful looking at the points of the how do we rebuild some of those things where learning may well have broken down, because I do think there's some really key strategies there which we can employ within our class for our learners to be able to start thinking deeper with some of the work they're doing. So some of the key takeaways from this then is that confidence in rebuilding through specific past success, not just that generic praise. Metacognition requires that strategy, instruction, modelling and practice, and then that gradual release. So using that model from the EEF, that stepped approach. And then the 7-step model provides that structured approach for any subject and any age as well. So regardless of setting, that can be a really useful way to engage your students and a really useful process to go through with your students as well, to give them access to task and for them to gain that success. And then that plan, monitor, evaluate cycle should be taught through that real subject content. And the more we can be really explicit about that, so we're not just teaching them generic metacognitive skills, we're teaching them the metacognitive skills within your subject areas, can be so powerful. So really now it's just thinking about your commitment to some of the recommendations which we've just looked at. So in the next 5 days, what is it that you think you can commit to? So one specific sentence on something that you're going to try. So this might be, for example, thinking aloud modelling in maths. On a Tuesday, so when you're teaching maths, how are you going to start to show your processes as you as the expert being able to articulate your thought process to particular tasks or challenges? Thinking about a confidence repair protocol which you might want to use with one learner, so thinking about a specific learner in mind. So when they show some of that learner breakdown models, what is it that you're going to do explicitly to support them? And then how you can use that support ladder potentially might be something for you to consider and use as well. So as we start to move into exploring classroom practice, I'll be handing over to Dominic in a second, who will take you through those following or those future recommendations. Thank you.